Hey everyone. Today we're going over a few key things starting out with the state of matter. The state of matter highly depends on the temperature. The higher the temperature, the more kinetic energy the molecules have and the more they're able to move around. Let's head over and check out the states of matter. In a gas, the molecules are at a high temperature, which means that they have a lot of kinetic energy that lets them move around very freely. But then we move on to a liquid. In a liquid, they're at a lower temperature, and so they have a little bit less kinetic energy, but they're still able to move around without having to be bonded with each other. And lastly, in a solid. In a solid, they have a lot less kinetic energy, and they're at a lower temperature. And so they're slowed down to a point where they can make these bonds with each other, but it doesn't always happen. When a substance is below its freezing point, but it's still not turned into a solid, this substance will be in a state called supercooled state. This supercooled state is where the substance is able to bond with each other, but it's not making these bonds as it needs a certain condition to be met. This condition being nucleation. Let's talk about nucleation. Nucleation. So at standard pressure, water freezes over at 0 degrees Celsius. For this to happen, the water molecules need a central point around which they will start forming this ice, also called the nucleation site. The nucleation site allows the water molecules to arrange themselves in the necessary way to form the structures that are ice crystals. This sets off a chain of reaction that allows the water molecules to start forming these bonds and become ice. The nucleation site tends to be a tiny impurity in the water bottle. An example is minerals. So some waters might contain some minerals, and these minerals will be used as nucleation site by the water molecules, making it easier for them to form the ice with these bonds. Another way for it to happen, though, is physical interaction. Whoa. Supercooled state. Now we're moving on to talking about how to get the water to the supercooled state. To get it there, you would need to place a water bottle in a cold area for a certain amount of time. For us, we found out that for a 17-ounce water bottle, the sweet spot was leaving it in the freezer for 2.5 hours. And so now we can move on to doing that, right? Let's go. Oh, snap. You weren't supposed to see that. Now all that's left is to put the water bottle in the freezer and play the waiting game.
All right, so let's check if our water is super cooled. It's been about 2 hours, something like that. So being careful when I grab it so as not to accidentally cause a nucleation site. As you can see, it's definitely still liquid. So I'm gonna come over here. Oh, did it by accident. That was actually a really fast one though. Normally it's not that fast. So I squeezed it a little bit and I caused a nucleation site. All right, and now we're gonna switch it over to the presentation and explain nucleation and growth a little bit more. How does matter change phases? Phase transitions are something we all know, but in this presentation, we're gonna take a deeper dive into how exactly a phase transition occurs. By what process does a gas turn into a liquid or a liquid into a solid? It's helpful to think about phase transitions in two parts. First nucleation, then growth. On the next slide, we're going to watch a short clip that demonstrates nucleation and growth. The white background is the parent phase, and the red splotches are the new emerging phase. You'll see that there are random emergences of the new phase constantly appearing, then disappearing, until one of sufficient size takes over completely. Before we can really get into a sufficient explanation of nucleation, I'm going to remind you of some terms from thermodynamics, namely Gibbs free energy, enthalpy, and entropy. The Gibbs free energy of a system is a measure of the amount of usable energy in that system, and usable energy is the energy that can do work. You can think of enthalpy as the internal energy of the system, where a negative delta H is going to mean that heat is released, while a positive delta H means heat is absorbed. And finally, we'll need to remember entropy, which we'll define as the measure of a system's thermal energy that is unavailable for useful work. We'll be talking about homogeneous nucleation first, which is much less common in nature, but mathematically it's much simpler to describe. When we say homogeneous, we mean there are no foreign particles in the solution. If, for example, we took our diagram to be ice emerging in water, we'd be talking about a chemically demineralized version of water, or in other words, pure H2O. If we take a look at this graph, we can see the Gibbs free energy plotted against the temperature. We can see that the current phase of a substance can be defined in terms of its Gibbs free energy. Personally, I think it's more intuitive to think about the phase change in terms of entropy. If you think about the entropy of a gas as compared to the entropy of a solid, the entropy of the gas would be much higher. Remember, though, that the Gibbs free energy is a function of the entropy, and a high entropy means a low free energy. You can also notice that the current phase of the compound is determined by the phase with the lowest Gibbs free energy at any point. Our equation is for the free energy change due to the nucleation of this ball of radius r. Our first term considers the free energy of the sphere, and this change in free energy, delta GV, is the free energy of the solid per unit volume minus the free energy of the liquid per unit volume. If we refer back to our graph, at any temperature before the melting point, we'll see this difference is negative. For our second term, we need to consider the surface energy, and that's why we have introduced the gamma term, which you can see is the energy per unit area of the solid-liquid interface. Combining these two, we have an equation for the change in free energy. So essentially what the math tells us is that at temperatures below the freezing point, it takes less energy to be a solid than it does to be a liquid.
In contrast to homogeneous nucleation, heterogeneous nucleation requires or is aided by the interaction with the impurities or the surface of the container, using them as nucleation sites. For a nucleation site to form in the liquid, it has to have a larger surface area represented by a sphere, as opposed to it being a hemisphere if it were to be at the surface of the container. The difference in surface area leads to a difference in required energies for them to become a nucleation site. The one with the smaller surface area requires less energy, and so it's more likely to happen. To sum up today's video, we want to mention that for a liquid to go to a solid state, it needs to be below its freezing point and it must find a nucleation site. In the case that it doesn't find a nucleation site, it will be considered supercooled. For example, water can be -5 degrees Celsius, but it still be a liquid if it does not find a nucleation site. And lastly, two types of nucleation would be homogeneous nucleation and heterogeneous nucleation. Guys, thanks for watching. Have a good day.